The first crash of wood splitting against iron rang through the valley like a gunshot, and I sprinted out of the house barefoot, heart hammering in my chest. The sight froze me cold. 3 trucks with the HOA logo crudely stenciled on the doors were parked in a line, engines idling. 6 men in reflective vests marked HOA security stood outside my grandfather's century-old barn, battering the door with crowbars like it was theirs to take. And at the center of the chaos stood Karen herself, her bulk wrapped in a floral blouse, sunglasses perched low, barking orders like a general at war. "Break it open!" she screamed, her voice shrill and triumphant. "This is community property now. Everything inside belongs to the HOA." For a split second, I couldn't breathe. That barn wasn't just lumber and nails, it was a living memory. My grandfather had built it with his own hands in 1923, raising beams with neighbors who are now long gone, hammering boards that still carried his sweat. Inside were not just tools and feed but boxes of history. War medals, letters, journals, keepsakes from generations. To see her standing there, demanding it be stripped bare, was like watching a grave being desecrated. I shouted across the yard, my voice cracking with fury. "That barn is mine. Get off my land." The so-called security team paused, uncertain, but Karen wheeled on me, her face red, her hand snapping through the air. "This is HOA jurisdiction. You failed to comply with our restoration order. We are repossessing assets for the good of the community." Restoration order? My stomach twisted. I remembered the slip of paper she'd stuffed into my mailbox weeks ago, scrawled with threats about unsafe structures and mandatory demolition. I had laughed then, tossed it aside, knowing full well no HOA could dictate the fate of a century-old barn on private ranch land. But now, staring at her men tearing at the door, I realized her threats weren't empty. I raced forward, shoving one of the men back from the lock. "Touch that barn again, and you'll answer to the sheriff," I warned. For a moment, hesitation flickered in his eyes, but Karen, bloated with arrogance, lifted her megaphone and bellowed, "He's resisting lawful enforcement. Keep going." And then, with a screech of old hinges, the barn door gave way. The men poured inside, flashlights sweeping over crates and hay bales. I stumbled after them, rage boiling. And there she was, Karen herself, digging through a wooden chest that had belonged to my grandfather, her stubby fingers rifling through letters tied with ribbon, tossing them carelessly to the floor. She turned, clutching a silver-plated pocket watch that had survived 2 world wars, and smirked. "Community artifacts," she said coldly. "These belong in the HOA's heritage display." The world tilted. My hands shook, my breath came shallow. But before I could tear it from her hand, a voice rang out from behind me that stopped everyone cold. "Drop it. Now." It was Lydia, my quiet neighbor, who ran the small antique shop on the corner of town. No one had known much about her past until that moment. She stepped into the barn's lantern glow, her voice steady as stone. "I worked for the State Historical Society for 20 years, she declared. "And I know theft of cultural property when I see it." She pulled a badge from her bag, not of law enforcement but of her former position, stamped and recognized by the state. "That barn is a registered site on the county's heritage map. You break one more board, you're facing felony charges." The men froze, flashlights quivering. Karen's smug mask cracked, her laugh forced and brittle. "She's bluffing," she snapped. "Keep searching." But no one moved. One by one, her guards lowered their tools, muttering that they hadn't signed up for this. Finally, the man holding the crowbar dropped it with a clatter and walked out. The rest followed, leaving Karen standing in the dust, clutching the stolen pocket watch like a thief cornered. I stepped forward, my voice low but shaking with power. "That watch belonged to my grandfather. Put it down." Her hand trembled, her face blotchy with rage, but she released it onto the crate with a clang. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in her eyes. By then, the sheriff's sirens wailed down the road. They'd been called by Miguel, another neighbor, who had filmed the entire raid from start to finish. Deputies stormed in, shining lights across the mess, listening as Lydia and I laid out what had happened. Karen tried one last desperate act, her voice shrieking. "It was an authorized inspection. I am the president of the HOA." The sheriff looked at her, unimpressed. You're under arrest for breaking and entering, theft, and trespassing. HOA president or not, you don't own this barn." The cuffs clicked, her wrists bound tight, and as they hauled her out, the neighbors who had gathered outside the barn erupted in shouts, not against me, but against her. Years of fear and resentment spilled over into a chorus of anger. "You've stolen enough," someone yelled. "We're done with you," shouted another. Her empire of intimidation crumbled in the face of raw truth. That night, I sat in the barn long after the deputies left, the pocket watch warm in my palm. The air smelled of hay and oil, the same as it had when I was a boy at my grandfather's knee. Around me, neighbors swept up the mess Karen's raid had left behind, unasked but willing, their hands careful with the relics she had tried to steal. For the first time in years, I felt something stronger than rage. I felt community, not the kind Karen preached about, ruled by fear and fines, but the real kind, built on shared history and respect. But this was only the beginning. Karen's arrest opened doors no one had dared push before. The county launched an audit of the entire HOA, exposing years of fraud and embezzlement. Her so-called security team turned state's witnesses, admitting she had bullied them into raids, promising payment she never delivered. And as the evidence piled up, the HOA collapsed like rotten timber. I realized then that my grandfather's barn had stood for more than 100 years, not just because of the wood and nails, but because people fought to preserve it. That night, under the same beams he once raised, I vowed that no tyrant with a megaphone would ever take it again. The barn smelled of dust and hay long after the deputies left, but it also smelled of victory. I sat there staring at the crates Karen had pried open, the ribbon-tied letters scattered across the floor, the pocket watch glinting in the lantern light. My hands trembled as I picked up the watch, tracing the initials my grandfather had etched into its back during the war. She would have pawned it for pennies, I thought bitterly. She had no respect for what it meant. But now it was safe again, and I vowed it would never leave our family's hands. Karen's arrest should have been the end, but instead it triggered the unraveling of something far larger. The sheriff had barely hauled her into the cruiser before word spread like wildfire. By morning, every neighbor within 10 miles had seen Miguel's footage uploaded to Facebook. Karen shrieking inside my barn, clenching my grandfather's watch, ordering men to seize assets for the community. The video was shared thousands of times, splashed across local news by noon, and dissected by national commentators before sunset. Karen became a symbol, not of power but of madness. Anchors shook their heads as they played her rant about community heritage, splicing it alongside her being dragged away in cuffs. Hashtags bloomed: Barngate, Karen Raid, Heritage Heist. For once, the whole world could see the woman we had lived under for years, unmasked and undone. But humiliation wasn't the only consequence. The county commissioners called an emergency session that week, ordering a full audit of the HOA. What they uncovered was uglier than anyone expected. Karen hadn't just weaponized bylaws, she had siphoned tens of thousands of dollars into personal accounts, billing the community for fake security patrols, phantom landscaping projects, even a so-called Community Cultural Preservation Fund that was nothing more than her personal shopping spree. She had dressed her greed in the language of stewardship, and people had believed her. The twist came when Paul, the treasurer who had been silent for years, finally broke. He arrived at the courthouse with a cardboard box full of incriminating files. Under oath, he admitted Karen had bullied him into signing falsified financial reports, threatening to destroy his reputation if he refused. His testimony was the nail in the coffin. The board members who once cowered at her feet scrambled to save themselves, resigning in droves, pointing fingers in every direction except their own. And yet Karen still fought. Even from her holding cell, she dictated furious letters to the local paper, insisting she was the victim of a conspiracy, that I had fabricated the deed, that Lydia was a fraud. She demanded release, painting herself as a martyr who had only been protecting the community. A few diehard loyalists clung to her story, but most had seen the footage. They knew. The real showdown came in court. The trial lasted weeks, but the tension was thick from the start. Karen strutted in wearing yet another floral blouse, her hair sprayed into a helmet. Her chin jutted out like she could stare down the entire judicial system. She interrupted witnesses, argued with the judge, even tried to fire her lawyer mid-trial and represent herself. The jury sat stone-faced as she spun delusion after delusion, each word digging her deeper into the pit. Lydia took the stand, her voice steady as she recounted how she had found Karen rifling through the crates. She spoke of her years in the State Historical Society, of her recognition of cultural theft, and how close Karen had come to destroying irreplaceable history. Miguel presented his footage, the sound of Karen's screeches echoing through the courtroom like nails on a chalkboard. I testified too, holding up my grandfather's watch in trembling hands, telling the jury what it meant to me, what it meant to my family, how it almost slipped into her greedy fingers forever. When the verdict came, the gavel slammed like thunder. Guilty on trespassing, theft, fraud, conspiracy, and destruction of property. Karen's face drained of color, her body slumping into the chair as if the weight of reality had finally crushed her. The sentence was years, not months. No fines could erase what she had done. She was led out sobbing, wailing about injustice, her voice cracking into nothing as the courtroom doors swung shut behind her. The HOA collapsed in the aftermath. Without Karen, it was a shell of frightened bureaucrats, and within weeks the county dissolved it entirely. For the first time in decades, neighbors owned their homes free of her constant threats. The bylaws that had strangled every barbecue, every paint job, every child's lemonade stand were torn up and burned in a bonfire behind the community center. People laughed and cried, tossing in copies of the endless violation notices Karen had mailed out, watching the flames consume the paper chains she had bound them with. As for me, I rebuilt the barn. Not its walls, they had never fallen, but its spirit. Neighbors gathered on weekends to help repair the damage, sweeping out dust, hammering loose boards, stacking hay where Karen's raid had left chaos. We held a dedication ceremony one autumn evening, lanterns glowing against the twilight. Lydia unveiled a plaque she had petitioned the county for. Vance Barn built 1923, protected 2023. My grandfather's legacy was no longer just mine, it belonged to the community that had once cowered under Karen's shadow and had finally found its voice. And still, sometimes at night, I walk to the barn alone, pocket watch in hand, listening to the silence where Karen's shrieks once rang. I think of what we lost, what we nearly lost, and what we reclaimed. The barn stands not just as a monument to my family, but as proof that tyranny, no matter how petty, no matter how loud, can be broken when people rise to meet it. So I ask you, reader, was I right to confront her head-on, to drag her lies into the open even when it risked tearing the neighborhood apart? Or should I have stood back, let the slow grind of bureaucracy take its course? Where would you have drawn the line when someone tried to steal your very history?